My mom testified against me in court to try to get me to pay child support for a baby that wasn't mine. This was because, in her view, family is family, but months later, I finally revealed my ex-wife's disgusting truth. Now, my mom is mad because the entire family is distancing themselves from her. My own dad wants to divorce her. I'm a 32-year-old man, and I never thought my life would implode the way it has over the past year and a half. What started as discovering my wife's affairs spiraled into a nightmare involving child support for a baby that wasn't mine, my own mother testifying against me in court, and family secrets that have torn everyone apart. My ex-wife and I were married for 6 years. The marriage wasn't perfect, but it was solid enough. We both wanted kids eventually, but agreed to wait until we were more financially stable. I work as a restaurant manager with decent pay but brutal hours. About 18 months ago, I noticed changes in my wife's behavior. She was secretive with her phone, working late more often, and our intimacy had disappeared. I tried talking to her about it, but she always dismissed my concerns as work stress. Then came the day I'll never forget. I came home early from work because of a pipe burst at the restaurant, and there she was with her coworker in our bed. I didn't make a scene, I just turned around, walked out, and drove to my friend's place. She blew up my phone with texts and calls, begging me to come back to talk. When I returned the next day, she was crying, claiming it was a mistake that had only happened once. I asked to see her phone, and after hesitating, she handed it over. I found hundreds of messages between her and this guy going back months. They weren't just having an affair, they were making plans for a future together. I moved out that day and filed for divorce within the week. The divorce was straightforward since we didn't have kids or many joint assets and was finalized 3 months later. I thought that would be the end of it, but boy was I wrong. About 2 months after our divorce, my ex contacted me saying she was pregnant and that I was the father. I was shocked because we hadn't been intimate for months before our separation. When I pointed this out, she claimed it must have been that one time right before everything fell apart. I knew this wasn't true. I told her I wanted a paternity test. She got angry, saying I was abandoning my responsibilities and needed to man up and support her and the baby. I refused, and she threatened to take me to court. True to her word, I was served with paternity and child support papers a few weeks later. I hired a lawyer immediately who assured me that with a paternity test, this would be easily resolved. What I didn't expect was my own mother's reaction. Instead of supporting me, she was furious that I was abandoning my child. No matter how many times I explained that the timeline didn't add up and that my ex had been cheating, my mother wouldn't listen. She kept saying, family is family, and that I needed to step up. On the day of the first court hearing, I was confident the judge would order a paternity test. As I sat in the courtroom, I noticed my mother walk in. I assumed she had come to support me despite our disagreement. I couldn't have been more wrong. When our case was called, my ex-wife's attorney called my mother as a witness. I was completely blindsided. My mother took the stand and testified that I had admitted to her that I was the father but was trying to get out of my responsibilities. She claimed I had a history of running away from problems and were just trying to avoid paying child support. None of this was true. I had consistently maintained that the baby couldn't be mine. My attorney objected multiple times, but the damage was done. The judge looked at me with disappointment. Thankfully, despite my mother's testimony, the judge still ordered a paternity test. I left the courthouse in shock, unable to even look at my mother as she tried to approach me. My father, who couldn't attend the hearing due to work, was livid when I told him what happened. He couldn't believe my mother would lie under oath against her own son. That night, he called to say they'd have the biggest fight of their 35-year marriage. The paternity test results came back 2 weeks later, confirming what I knew all along: I was not the father. The case was dismissed, but the damage to my family was already done. My mother refused to apologize. Instead, she doubled down, saying biology doesn't make a family and that I should have stepped up regardless. She actually had the audacity to claim that since I had been married to my ex when the baby was conceived, which wasn't even true, I had a moral obligation to support the child. Meanwhile, my ex had moved in with her coworker, the actual father of her child, yet she was still bitter about losing the case and began spreading rumors in our social circle that I had abandoned her. At this point, I was emotionally exhausted and just wanted to move on. I started seeing a therapist and focused on my job and rebuilding my life, but the situation with my mother continued to eat at me. Then came the next bombshell. About 6 months after the court case, I was having dinner with my father when he confided something that made everything suddenly make sense. My mother had had an affair early in their marriage, and my older sister, who I always believed was my full sister, was actually the product of that affair. My father had chosen to raise her as his own despite knowing the truth. This revelation hit me hard. My mother had projected her own past onto my situation. She expected me to do what my father had done, raise another man's child without question. The difference was my father made that choice himself. My mother was trying to force me into it through lies and manipulation. I decided to confront my mother. I invited both parents to my apartment, and before she could start her usual guilt trip, I laid out everything I knew. I told her I understood why she did what she did in court, but that it didn't make it right. I explained how her lies had nearly cost me years of financial support for a child that wasn't mine, all because she wanted to rewrite her own history. My mother went pale. She looked at my father, who nodded, confirming he had told me. She burst into tears, not of remorse but of anger. She accused my father of betraying her by sharing private family business and stormed out. That night, my sister called me, hysterical. Apparently, my mother had gone straight to her house and told her everything about her biological father. My sister had never known the truth. She was devastated not by the revelation itself but by finding out this way, as a weapon in my mother's arsenal, rather than as a thoughtful conversation. Why I had mentioned this earlier is that while gathering evidence for my case, I discovered emails between my ex-wife and my mother dating back to before our divorce was finalized. They had been in contact the entire time, planning how to handle the pregnancy situation. My mother had been advising my ex on how to approach me, what to say to make me feel guilty, and even suggested specific language for legal filings. This discovery made my blood boil. Not only had my mother lied under oath, but she. You can click on share and more to see if there is a part 2.